All right, everyone, it's about 1 o'clock our time, so we're gonna go ahead and jump right in. So hello and welcome back to many of you who attended our first webinar earlier this month. For those of you joining for the first time, we're so glad to have you as part of this Transfer Student Leadership Summit. At the first session, we heard from amazing panelists, Barbara Kobalowski and Janet Marling, and we're definitely left inspired by our peer advocates from UC Berkeley's Transfer Student Center. If you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to check out the recording on the UT Austin School of Undergraduate Studies YouTube channel and to get a great understanding of the current state of transfer and how student leaders can make a real difference on their campus. We have so much really good content for today. I really want to jump right in, but before we do, I want to make sure that we mention just a few things. First, though we have changed to a webinar format, we still hope to hear from everyone logged in today. So please make sure to use the chat to share your thoughts, pose questions to the whole group, and then answer any of the polls that pop up to get your feedback that everyone can see, and then send in your questions for panelists and presenters through the Q&A session. You don't have to wait for that. We might get to them towards the end of those components, but make sure to direct your questions for any of the speakers there. Second, I want to make sure that you register for the Apple AirPod drawing. So we'll be putting that link into the chat, both in Zoom and on YouTube. So please go ahead and fill that out as soon as possible. We'll be closing out registration for that at the end of our first moderated panel session. So make sure to get to that early. And third, we want to thank the Greater Texas Foundation for their support of the Transfer Summit for the second year in a row now. Without their generous support, this convening would not be possible. We also want to thank our partners at the National Resource Center for the first year experience and students in transition. If you work with students who are new to your institution, I really cannot recommend more highly their resources online, their workshops, their conferences, and we appreciate their help as we move this Transfer Summit to an online format this year. So this session's theme is transfer belonging, culture, and community. You might hear me referencing belonging, community, transfer culture, feeling validated, inclusivity. And there are important distinctions among these terms. But for today's purposes, though, I hope that what you'll take it to mean is, do transfer students feel like their institution is designed with transfers in mind? That transfer students feel welcomed and entitled to all the benefits of being a student at your school? Do they feel valued and validated as full members of the campus community? So playing a little loose with some of those terms today, but kind of for the benefits of expediency, I hope that you'll let me use those terms kind of interchangeably. So oftentimes, let me move these slides a bit forward. Sorry, just one moment. Here we go. So speaking on transfer student belonging, sorry for that technical glitch. For oftentimes for student success, and in particular for transfer students, we measure their success with retention rates, persistence, time to graduation, all of which are critical to understanding students' academic progress and success. However, anyone who has been through any form of transition or tried to find their place in a new environment knows that until you feel comfortable and feel like you can be yourself, you're not going to reach your full potential. So some percentage, often a substantial percentage, of your time and your energy will be spent on making space in your new environment, or worse, you're spending that time worrying if things will ever get better. And the research backs this up. Students with a stronger sense of belonging tend to earn high GPAs, are more likely to persist to graduation, and they report greater social connectedness. There's a reason that feeling like the new kid in school is a common expression when you feel like you've just been dropped into a situation where everyone else has it figured out and you're just trying to get used to your new surroundings. And this goes for being a transfer in college too. As a transfer student once mentioned to me in an interview, it feels like everyone else is cruising down the highway while you're stuck trying to find the opening just to get on the road. Sometimes when you merge onto the highway, you're left to find just that small opening in the traffic where you can make your own way. Sometimes you end up driving on the shoulder for a really bumpy transition. And then sometimes you have someone, in the case of transfer, maybe it's a student leader or an empathetic advisor or professor who waves you in, makes space for you, and helps you get caught up to speed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What are those barriers to establishing a sense of belonging, finding a campus culture that is inclusive to transfer students? What are some of the tips and best practices that each of us can implement in our work? And what are some of the big picture policy changes that we can advocate for to make our institutions more transfer receptive? But before we hear from our speakers, we want to hear from everyone out there on Zoom. So if you're a transfer student or like me, it's been more than a few years since you were a transfer student, but please use this poll to share about your experience. So let me pull this up real quick. Let's see. My mouse has disappeared. If one of the co-hosts wants to hit that first polling question, for some reason I can't get to it. Thank you so much. So if you struggled with whether or not you belonged at your new institution, what contributed to that feeling? Could be peers on campus, could be staff. This could really be anyone who works on campus. We just pointed out a few examples of academic advisor, someone who works in housing, student life, instructors. That could be your professor, your TA, anyone who's an instructor in a course or class. Institutional policies. This could be starting with admissions, moving through financial aid, if you're eligible or not to participate in an academic program or a social program. Was it your personal mindset? Was it just the way that you went in? Nothing particularly happened, but maybe just the way you were thinking about things. Could be your family, could be friends off campus, student organizations, or something else. If it is something else, or if it's any combination of those things, if you want to put that up in the chat, we'd love to hear about your particular experience. Leave this up just for a bit more. We've had almost half of y'all have put in at least an answer. All right, we can close this out. We'll share these results. So you can see some of the most popular answers were peers on campus, so the other students that you're on campus with. Personal mindset was another big one. And then a little bit further down the line, we have policies and instructors, but it really seems that peers and personal mindset were some of the top ones there. So we're going to go to our next question. So kind of the complement or the flip side to that is, if you felt that you did eventually find that that place, that sense of belonging on campus, what contributed to that feeling that you felt like you had your community? You can pull this up. Let's see. Should be the next question on this set. Our first time doing a webinar, y'all. We're sorry about some of these technical difficulties. Let's see. Is the question number 2 a little bit further down on the same page? Is that right? Well, if you want to share some of those answers in the chat, we're going to keep moving things forward. Oh, here we go. Sorry. I just wasn't able to see it, but you see some of these same answers. So student organizations actually played a much larger role in creating that nice sense of belonging, sense of community on campus. Friends from off campus and your peers played another big part. Staff like advisors were a little bit more contributing to that sense of belonging than to that sense of uncertainty. So thank you all for sharing those experiences. I look forward to seeing some of those answers in the chat as well. So before we jump into our panel, I do want to mention just a few of our community agreements that we want to hear from everyone. So please share in the chat. When there's opportunities to share later on with raising your hand, please engage. And then also create space for other viewpoints. So I know that my work, working with transfer students a lot, I have learned that we all have unique stories. We all have unique transfer experiences, although we have similar common points, that we do have unique stories. So just open that space and open your mind to other experiences as well. And then just another quick reminder about the AirPod drawing. You'll have until the end of this first panel to fill out that form, and then we'll pull it at the end. You do have to be present at the end of the presentation to be the winner. You can share and follow past summits at #TransferSummit on all sorts of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. If you're having any trouble with technical support, if you had trouble with Zoom or getting onto the YouTube page, please shoot an email if you get kicked off of this to fye.ga@austin.utexas.edu. And then we are on YouTube as well. That link is in your email. All right, at this point, I'm going to invite our 2 panelists to join us on screen. We have Dr. Catherine Hartman from the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Student-Centered Transition. We also have Dr. Veronica Vermont from California State University, Long Beach. Welcome to you both. So thrilled and honored to have you all join us for this session on this really important topic. And I hope you're having a great day so far. Let me give a brief introduction. Y'all have really are 2 experts on this topic of transfer student belonging, community. Dr. Veronica Vermont is the Policy and Practice Dissemination Coordinator for the Center for Evaluation and Educational Effectiveness at California State University, Long Beach. Prior to this position, Dr. Vermont was a postdoctoral scholar and a lecturer in the Department of Chicano Studies at UC Santa Barbara. As a grad student, she developed a research agenda focused on the community college post-transfer experience at selective research-intensive universities. In one of those studies, participants shared experiences receiving negative comments and or exposure to community college stereotypes from dominant groups on campus. In particular, traditional or native students, teaching assistant faculty. Dr. Vermont recognized these comments as microaggressions and coined the term transfer student microaggression to describe the backhanded compliments and the insults community college transfer students endured at selective research-intensive universities. Dr. Vermont has presented and submitted manuscripts on the topic of transfer and transfer stigma in particular. Welcome, Dr. Vermont. And Dr. Catherine Hartman is a postdoctoral research associate at the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition. Dr. Hartman's research focuses on community college student persistence and engagement, student transfer from community colleges to four-year schools, and English learners' experiences in post-secondary contexts. Prior to joining the National Resource Center, she served as a graduate center at the Center for Community College Student Engagement at the Charles Dana Center at the University of Texas at Austin. She also worked as a grad assistant in the Dean of Students Office and the Office of Academic Advising at the College of William and Mary. So welcome back to UT, Dr. Hartman, virtually at least. We're glad to have you joining us as well. So before we jump into our content questions, I just like to hear from both of you. How did you get started thinking about transfer in your work? We can start with Dr. Vermont.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. The way that I got interested in transfer was basically I was a transfer student. So I grew up here in California. I attended Rio Hondo Community College in the city of Whittier, and I transferred to UCLA. And when I was at UCLA, I felt like a second-class citizen. Back then, there weren't many outreach programs for transfer students or much outreach to our community. So when I started grad school at UC Santa Barbara, I knew that I wanted to explore and research the post-transfer experience at selective universities such as, the UC system. And so that's what I developed my program of research on.
Great, thank you for sharing that. And Dr. Hartman?
Yeah, so I'm also very excited to be here. And like Veronica, I was also a transfer student, a community college transfer student. I started college at Tidewater Community College in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is where I'm from. And after completing my associate degrees, I transferred to William and Mary, which is also in Virginia. I'm interestingly, I'm also a third generation transfer student. So both my mom and my grandma attended the community college that I went to and transferred to another institution. So very familiar with transfer, heard a lot of transfer stories growing up. Never thought that I would actually pursue it though. But I think a lot about my own experiences and with transfer, and that really drove my research and the work that I do right now. So my expectations of life after transfer were not my reality. They weren't my actual experiences. And a lot of this was due to like a lot of perceived differences between myself and my peers at William and Mary. So for example, I was a commuter student. I actually lived almost an hour away from campus. So that was a big deal. Not a lot of students at William and Mary commuted. It's a highly residential campus, so I automatically felt very different from them. A lot of other students on campus were also heavily involved in activities, so like social organizations, academic groups and whatnot. And I was actually working almost full time, and that really impacted my desire to engage, my desire to want to drive an hour up to campus. So I just overall felt very different, and I didn't feel like a true William and Mary student in that way that others were. So I struggled to find my footing and decided to pursue a master's degree in higher ed admin, also at William and Mary, with the intention of improving the transfer experience. And it was in my master's program that I learned about research. I didn't realize that people made a living doing research about and for and with transfer students and community college students. My mind was totally blown by that. And that was not a career path that I had envisioned going into grad school. So I became really drawn to research and becoming more involved with it and learning how I might be able to do it on my own. And that led me to applying to doc programs. And so I went to UT Austin, graduated in 2019, and that set me up for the position that I'm in right now.
Great. Both of your answers remind me of Dr. Kobalowski's comment last session that folks who were transfer students or were close to transfer students, it really impacts them, and it's a group that you want to continue to help and to learn more about and to support. And so once you are a transfer student, I think we all kind of understand it's something that you want to improve the transfer experience, and it's something that you want to be a part of. So thank you for sharing that. So Catherine, we'll start with our first question for you. First, I do want to acknowledge that and let everyone else know that we've worked together in a number of capacities, while you were at UT Austin. The transfer community is tightly knit. And so I feel like I might be anticipating what some of your answers are here, but hopefully I think it'd all be great for you to share with everyone else. My first question is just setting up the conversation around, sense of belonging and building transfer community. Can you just kind of briefly go into what some of the benefits are? Why is it important for transfer students to establish that sense of belonging on campus?
Yeah, definitely. So Jeff and I recently presented on this topic at NASTS. So apologies for the repetitiveness, Jeff. But overall, in both research and practice, we know that sense of belonging is an important concept and a significant variable associated with multiple aspects of student success, including their academic success. And often this is measured by your grade point average, so how well you're doing academically. It's also associated with your retention, or whether or not you stay in school and you work toward your degree, your well-being, and a lot of other things. It's also, a sense of belonging is also an important aspect of social connectedness. So whether or not you feel like you have peer groups and various connections on campus with people like faculty and staff. So I also want to point out that sense of belonging is a bit of a nebulous term, right? So you might think like, what does that mean? Like, who am I belonging to? And in the literature and from research, we know that it can point to multiple things, like I've mentioned, connectedness and belonging to other students on campus, with faculty and staff, but it can also, you might think of this too as like your connectedness to your institution overall. So the culture and the community, and even the community surrounding the institution. So it's really encompassing of multiple aspects of belonging in that way. And despite all this evidence that sense of belonging is important and it's a positive thing to have, and we want to foster this for students, it's often understudied among transfer students, and particularly in studies that have looked at first-year students' adjustment. So, in the conversations about transfer, we know that the first year, once you come into your receiving institution, is really important in establishing connections, but there's really not a lot of information that we have about students' connectedness and their sense of belonging throughout their experience, but also in that pivotal year. But we do know, again, from research and practice, that there are many instances in which transfers might feel or experience institutional neglect. So this might manifest in things like policies, practices, and procedures that your institution has in place or that people enact that can exclude you either implicitly or explicitly. So you might experience this when you're not able to participate in something that's available to non-transfer students, or you might think about the timing of your transfer. So I think about my own experience transferring into William & Mary as a junior. I didn't have a lot of time to really get a sense of like what was available to me. I really had to hit the ground running. So one thing that I look back on and I feel like I wasn't able to do was study abroad, which is a big thing at William & Mary, and I'm sure at other institutions, but that was just something that my advisor never presented to me. I had heard about like ad nauseum in admissions tours on the website and everything, and it was just something that I felt like wasn't an option for me, again, because I had such limited time on campus and I had to complete my requirements. So those feelings of otherness or marginalization can contribute to feeling like you don't belong on campus. And you might also feel like you're not validated in that way, like you're not a true UT student or whatever institution you're at, because you're not able to fully participate and engage, right? And
I think you bring up.
I'm sorry?
I was just going to say, I think you bring up an excellent point that it's not only what is said, but what's not said sometimes, right? Whether you're advising scenario that these opportunities were never even presented to you, that nothing was said directly to you, but it was the idea that you're a transfer, you don't have time for this, there's no way you can work it into your degree plan. Let's not even talk about this experience that most of the students at your school participated in.
Right. And then if you feel like you're not able, again, to fully participate, that can further heighten this feeling of disconnection, or that you don't belong, or that you're different from your peers on campus, definitely.
Absolutely. And that leads right into our first question for Veronica. And I know that you've written literally hundreds of pages on this. I'm asking you in one question to, to sum up your thoughts, but you've identified transfer student stigmatization, and you often do that through student voices that you amplify in your work, which I really appreciate. Can you speak to how transfer student stigmatization manifests itself through interactions with their peers, their instructors, and university policies?
Sure. So I'll start with, when I was at UCLA, I have training in sociology. So at heart, I'm a sociologist, right? So I tend to look at the macro picture and then, narrow it down to the micro picture. And so what I kind of discussed in my manuscript that's under review right now is that we first have to start with societal perceptions of community college students, right? And what those societal perceptions are. And, in watching, TV shows like Community or Big Bang Theory, the butt of the joke tends to be the community college student, right? And there's this idea that community college students are lazy, they lack motivation, they don't have any direction, right? And that's why they're at community colleges, right? Which completely ignores things like educational inequality, systemic racism, right? The school to prison pipeline. So that's where I start this work. And in terms of how it manifests at, four-year institutions, we as members of this society internalize these negative stereotypes about community college students, about transfer students, and it then perpetuates four-year institutions so that traditional students, faculty, administrators, especially at selective or prestigious institutions, they kind of assume these things of transfer students, right? And so the way that it manifests is in transfer student microaggressions, where traditional students or even faculty will make comments about transfer students, such as, oh, transfer students, they don't know what they're doing here. Don't tell people you're a transfer student. Nobody likes transfer students because you only come here for 2 years and use our resources. Or students who have heard others say like, oh, you came from a community college, well, then you better get started on that research paper now because it's going to take you way longer. So that's how it manifests among traditional students and faculty at these selective institutions. And I think I saw someone also asking the question earlier in the chat box, sorry, about sense of belonging and how we feel. When did I establish like that sense of belonging? And whether we were non-traditional students. I want to start by saying that I was a non-traditional student. I actually got kicked out of high school and went to a continuation high school and then started a community college. And I think even in my research, I found a sense of belonging in their community, and so that's when they start to feel like they're part of the community. So that's what I wanted to add to. When I found my group, that's when I felt like I am a UCLA student. This is my school. But anyhow, so I hope I answered your question on how it manifests at a 4 year.
Yes, and it's I think the example you gave just kind of resonates probably with a lot of people on this webinar, that someone says something, not really thinking of its impact. Maybe the intention wasn't necessarily to cause harm, but these little cuts add up and really can cause damage to a student who is more than capable of succeeding at their institution. So I appreciate you highlighting those student voices. So Catherine, I know you've studied how students perceive and experience transfer through the lens of belonging uncertainty, which emphasizes that no actual event of bias or discrimination needs to actually happen for students to feel like they don't belong. The student arrives on campus with this uncertainty without necessarily being put down for being a transfer or running into a policy that disadvantages them, which I think that this concept is such a good fit or complement with Veronica's framework of transfer student stigmatization, because it highlights the idea that it could either be externally generated through interactions with other folks or policies, or it could be internally generated with this belonging uncertainty mindset. Can you speak to that concept and how students can internally generate this belonging uncertainty?
Yeah, so as Jeff mentioned, belonging uncertainty is really concerned with when you're concerned about the quality of your social relationships and whether or not you may or may not be included. And it's, again, associated with a lot of success outcomes, including persistence and academic achievement. So Jeff and I have found through our research that belonging uncertainty can happen like both socially and academically, and even sort of in between in the socio-academic space. And in our research, we've looked at a few different concepts related to belonging uncertainty, including stereotype threat, or this idea that you're afraid of confirming a negative stereotype that's specific to your social group or an identity that you might affiliate with. So for example, we spoke with, or one of us spoke with a transfer student at an institution in Texas, and she was talking about an experience that she had in her class at the university post-transfer, where her faculty member said something to the effect of, if you took calculus at your community college or at a community college, you screwed yourself. So Veronica, I think that this example relates a lot to what you were just describing, in that the student having been or was a community college transfer student was afraid or worried about their academic performance in that course, and that any sort of mishap or misstep or mistake that they were to make could be attributed to them having gone to a community college and received a community college education, which in the mind of the faculty member and their expression of it was not something positive, right? Jeff and I have also explored this concept of attributional ambiguity. And this really means that you're not certain how you'll be treated or what outcomes might come about because of a certain identity or category that you affiliate with, and that can include transfer. And for some students that we spoke with, they expressed or shared stories where they felt like something was off. No one was explicitly saying something bad, and they couldn't point to like a specific instance of discrimination, but they, again, just felt like something was off and that they didn't belong in the moment. So for example, another student that we spoke with, also at an institution in Texas, was older. She had taken several decades off of school to raise her family, and then returned to the community college and eventually transferred to the university that we were looking at. And she talked about an instance early in her transfer experience, post-transfer, in which one of her faculty said something like, turn and talk to your neighbor, or turn and form a group in class, right? And so the student looked at both sides, looked to the left, looked to the right, and students were just naturally sort of pairing off, and she was left in the middle without a partner. And nobody really said to her, like, we aren't including you because of your age or because you're a transfer, but she just felt like because she had or belonged to those groups or identified as such, that there was some form of mistreatment, and then she had to awkwardly, insert herself and be like, hey, is it okay if I, become a member of your group? And then she had to think, okay, well, I can't, act like the mom of the group. So it was very conscious of her actions and how they might, confirm some stereotypes that students might have about her.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those examples, Catherine. I think it's the idea that it can be something direct, like the professor's comment, or it could just be something that the student's picking up on, or just a mindset that they've walked into that for whatever reason, maybe it's because I applied to this institution, I didn't get in the first time, but for some reason you feel like there's a deficiency, when we all know that there is no transfer student deficiency. So this next question is for you both. You've both done research looking at the idea of what it means to be a transfer student, or to identify as a transfer student. And not all transfers do identify as transfer students. So can you tell us more about which students are less likely to identify as transfer students? And what would you recommend to the transfer student leaders that are here today on how they can form programming and promote programming to all transfer students, knowing that some of them may not want to identify or think of themselves as transfers?
Go ahead and start. So yes, in my study, I had about 38 transfer students that were in their second year, so they were technically seniors. And in that study, I again argue that transfer students come in initially feeling like transfer students, right? Like they don't belong, and that's their salient identity. And what I found was that there were students who they loved the fact that they were transfer students. They openly acknowledged that they were transfer students to others on campus. And these tended to be students who purposely started at the community college. Maybe they were first generation college students. Maybe they saw that they could save on tuition costs and they were proud of this decision because it was a smart money decision. Some students just didn't feel ready to leave home. So I did find students who disidentified with the transfer identity. And these students tended to be the ones that internalized the negative stereotypes and biases against community college students, right? And because most of the students in my sample tended to be within the same age group as traditional students on campus, and they're not identifiably looking like transfer students, right? They would just lie or omit or be ambiguous about their identity. So when others would ask them like, hey, you know, how long have you been here? They'd be like, oh, I'm a third year or whatnot. They would just omit it, right? Because they had this internalized embarrassment, right? So when we think about what can transfer student leaders do to kind of like, you know, bring in these students, I think first it starts with the institution. I think we need to step back. Again, I'm going from like the institutional level down, right? What messages are the institutional agents giving to transfer students, right? Are they actively recruiting at community colleges? Do they have a transfer student center? Are they providing student support services to transfer students? All these types of things send a message to incoming transfer students that they're welcomed, they're valued, and we're invested in your success here, right? If you don't have any of these things, what messages are you conveying then, right? So I think it starts at the institutional level. And then with the more micro level, if we're looking at leaders in the community, just more outreach on campus, right? Try to have social events where transfer students can gather and feel that they're part of a community, right? So that would be my advice. And also start with the campus climate survey, right? Every institution is unique, so the needs of transfer students at each institution is going to be unique. So we first have to assess what are the challenges that our transfer students are experiencing here, right? And that starts with the campus climate survey and maybe some focus groups to find out what those challenges are, right? So those are my recommendations.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start by saying that I don't think it's necessarily a positive or a negative thing if you do or don't identify as a transfer. Being a transfer student means many different things to many different people. So for some, you know, some people might think of themselves as a transfer when they start college because they're starting at a specific institution with the intention of transferring. For others, that affiliation or that identity might emerge later. So, you know, once you're at a new institution or going through the application process. So there's really no defining point, and it's definitely not a linear or uniform process in any way. Jeff mentioned that we're working on many projects together, and in some of our research, we found that particularly among neo-traditional students, or you know, moving past this definition of a traditional student on campus, neo-traditional students, such as those that are older than 18 to 24, who are veterans, who are taking care of families, many of those students actually didn't describe themselves as transfer students in our work. They more described transfer as a process to get them to where they wanted to be. So transfer was a mechanism that they could use to complete their bachelor's degree or move from the community college to the four-year institution for many of them. So, you know, connecting with transfer it is complicated and it means multiple things. So transfer could be perceived as something negative for some students. It can be positive. But overall, I think being a transfer student for many is something distinct and different than non-transfer students. So you as a transfer are different because you bring a variety of experiences and a wealth with you that other students may or may not have. And for some students, encountering multiple hurdles or barriers, like, you know, I think about myself feeling very different from my peers, that can reinforce that like transfer is different, lesser than, discounted, right? It's something bad. So that was something that I internalized. But, you know, for others, being a transfer is a point of pride. It's something that they can point to and say, look, I worked really hard to get here. The admissions rate for transfers is a lot lower than it is for non-transfer students. So again, it's very complicated, right? And I think for students, some advice that I might give is to think about like why or why not you might be feeling like you're not a part of the transfer community. Is that because there's not a visible community on campus? There aren't supports available? Like kind of digging deeper into that reflection. And then thinking about the communities and spaces in which you do feel like you belong. And if those sources of support are validating and affirming and they give you the support that you need to thrive and to succeed. I also think that, you know, a lot of times, like in undergrad, I would, because there wasn't a transfer student center on campus or there wasn't a transfer student support group, I didn't know that I could go to my faculty and talk about transfer. Like I just didn't know who to go to, right? But knowing that there are like people on campus, if you initiate conversations, people I've found in my experience, especially faculty, are generally receptive to talking with students and maybe, you know, connecting you to multiple points of support and other resources on campus to help you build that web of support that you can need or that you need to thrive.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments where, you know, for some students, you know, I think building transfer pride is probably the goal. For some students, the starting place might be minimizing, you know, some of those, you know, uncertain feelings about being a transfer student. And, you know, if they could have easily come across legitimate, you know, microaggressions, legitimate policy roadblocks. And so how do you make a student feel good about transfer when they've had absolutely legitimately difficult experiences as a transfer? And so that might be a good starting place for some. And Veronica, I really appreciate, I know in your work, you've referred to as non-transfers as quote unquote native. You know, we see often in colleges terminology, you know, and there's not, I haven't found a great way to refer to non-transfers besides non-transfers, but native, even just the terms we use for non-transfers can really make you think, if I'm not native, then what am I? Or to be native means that you might belong somewhere or you're entitled to something, whereas other students are visitors, guests, immigrants. I'm not sure what the term would be to counter native, but it certainly feels less inclusive or included into that community. So I appreciate that. We have one more question. I hope we have some, I think we have time for it. And it kind of speaks to one of the questions that popped up in the Q&A. Someone had asked, Veronica in particular, if you happen to know the percentage of transfer students who are people of color or maybe don't qualify for aid or older, so maybe non-traditional or students of color. And it kind of is a preview for the next session for this webinar series. We'll talk more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when we talk about transfer, you know, we're really talking about equity. This was a highlight of the opening statements for the NISTS conference this year. Transfer students are more likely to be students of color. They're more likely to have served in the military, more likely to be parents, more likely to come from lower income families, to be immigrant or first generation Americans, and to be first generation college students. So transfer students are diverse, and they add to, or at many institutions, quite frankly, they are the diversity in the student body. So what does it mean when campus environments, the physical spaces, the words we use, the policies we carry out, make transfer students feel unwelcomed?
So to start, in terms of the percentages, I know that the university where I collected my data from, 42% of the students, undergraduate student population identified as first generation college students. It was a Hispanic serving institution, which means that at least 25% of students identified as Latino or Hispanic. In my sample, I had about 18% that identified as Latino. The majority of my participants were white because it's a predominantly white institution. And with regard to students of color, I first wanted to address an issue that came up in my research as well. The literature finds that when students of color attend predominantly white institutions, they tend to seek out what Tara Yoso coined as a counter space, right? And a counter space offers this sense of belonging and shared culture, right? So if we think about a counter space for Latino students, we can think of something that is a culturally oriented student organization, right? However, I also found in my research that even within these quote unquote safe spaces, transfer students would experience transfer student microaggressions. So even within these spaces, there was this sense of not belonging and not being included fully, right? So that's one of the things that I wanted to address. And I think going back to your initial question, Jeff, you mentioned how can we combat these types of stereotypes, or what was the last part of your question? I was answering like a 3-part question.
Yeah, it was a little more open-ended of just,
okay.
You know, what can we do when students feel unwelcomed by policies, by the words that people use, by interactions, but absolutely, you know, what can we do to counter some of these? Is it raise awareness? Is it you know, create space? What are some of your recommendations?
So definitely creating awareness is extremely important. I think here's the problem, however, with like students who are attending like institutions like the one where I collected my data from that were considered, it's a research intensive institution. Faculty, sometimes they're seen as gods, right? Untouchable. And so the problem is that when students encounter transfer student microaggressions from faculty, they weren't likely to address it, right? However, what did work at this particular institution was that enough transfer students, there was a critical mass of transfer students that came together who were like, we're tired of this. We are tired of these discriminatory policies that don't give us priority registration. We're tired of getting weeded out of like STEM programs. So they found allies, transfer student allies within like the Office of Student Affairs, faculty members, graduate students. They came to me and they wanted to use some of my research, and they advocated for a transfer student center on their campus, right? They raised awareness among these allies that they found. And it was successful because a year later, there was a transfer student center that was, you know, erected at this institution. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of times the onus is on students to kind of come together and raise these issues. However, if you get enough, a critical mass of these students, and you get enough momentum, I think it is possible to make positive changes towards transfer students. And I also think that on the institutional level, I think institutional agents need to recognize that this is happening, right? These students do not feel valued. These students are not coming in and feeling that they're part of the community. What can we do to address this, right? It's not enough just to ignore it and think, oh, they're only here for 2 years, so we don't have to do anything about this, right? They're paying tuition, right? You need to make sure that your students are feeling welcome, included, and are going to succeed toward the finish line, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we can do. And the first step is obviously recognizing it. And in the past year, we've seen a lot of workshops based around implicit bias training, right? We saw a lot of workshops on racial microaggressions. Well, at the institutional level, include transfer student stereotypes in there, include transfer student microaggressions. What are the little slights that teaching assistants and faculty are, saying or doing that are making students feel, unwelcomed, right? So those are some of my recommendations for that. Thank you.
Those are great. I love the idea of a critical mass, and that can form in all sorts of ways. It could be officially under a student government. It could be part of a recognized student organization. It could just be, a regular transfer students who band together. I mean, it can form in so many different ways, but the student voice is, again, so imperative to that conversation. Catherine?
Yeah, I'll just add that, to both of your points, we can't have conversations about transfer without also talking about equity, right? We know that one of the main functions of community colleges is the transfer function, right? And to your point exactly, Jeff, there are large numbers of racially and ethnically minoritized students that attend community colleges and rely on that function to complete their academic goals, but that's not a reality for many students because of forms of institutional neglect and these microaggressions and many other factors that agents and institutions do and enact toward transfer students, right? And continuing to ignore transfer and transfer students just continues to neglect access and opportunity for these students and continues to perpetuate inequalities across racial and ethnic groups. In the literature, there's a well-documented racial transfer gap in which white students transfer at higher rates than non-white students, which is a huge concern for equity and educational success for students. And if institutions and staff don't tend to transfer and support students and meet them where they're at and develop programs, spaces, and policies that are asset-based, it'll only continue to push students out of the transfer pipeline. So, you mentioned earlier that often transfers are the big diversity number. They increase those rates, they increase enrollment rates overall, right? They're used in that way. That's a transactional view of transfer and one that doesn't humanize them, doesn't value students individually, including the wealth of knowledge and the experiences that they bring with them to the learning community and the campus overall. So, we all know that transfers are so much more than their transfer identity. They can help enhance these learning spaces for the benefit of all students and really, change the culture of campuses to make them more dynamic for everyone. So that's what I'll add.
No, I appreciate that. It makes you think of our UT Austin experience, and transfer students have been their best advocates by far. Their voices have led to the most positive change we've seen for transfer students on our campus. And I don't think that's unique. That's really why we started this Transfer Student Leadership Summit, was the idea that these students have powerful voices and are powerful advocates, and let's give them more knowledge about transfer in general and expose them to best practices and what's worked at other campuses, what hasn't worked at other campuses, to help inform their arguments and their line of reasoning when they're speaking with administrators and faculty and staff. So I appreciate that. Yes.
I wanted to add something too. I think it's important to mention that community college students talk amongst themselves as well about what institutions they want to transfer to. And this is what I found in my research, was that students would choose universities that they had heard were more transfer friendly. So that's another thing that institutions need to think about, is that these students are talking, and they're talking about, well, which ones are transfer friendly and which ones are not. So, I mean, at the end, institutions care about enrollment, right? So that's what institutions care about. So this is one other thing that they need to consider, is that community college students are talking and they're making decisions based on reputation. So that's another point I wanted to raise.
That is an excellent point, and I appreciate you bringing that up. I think we have time just to address a couple of the questions that came up in Q&A before we move to our student presentation. Mandy, did you see any in particular that came up either in chat or in Q&A?
So one question was for either panelist, what are some possible steps that an institution can take to counter implicit biases or judgments from faculty towards transfer students? I think this is referring to that comment about the professor saying like your calculus at community college isn't as good as the calculus here at our university.
If I can jump in just real quick with a little bit of what we've done at UT Austin. A couple of years ago, I forget where I got the idea. I'm sure it was from a school I saw a presentation from at NISTS, but we started making a transfer student infographic that just gave really the basic information about who our transfer students are, how they're involved on campus, and then about their student success rates. And when we showed that when transfer students are involved in learning communities and other types of support that all other students on campus are pretty much automatically enrolled in, that those transfer students who are part of our support programs have the same GPA as other students on campus. They graduate on time, that all these things put in place. And it's when students don't have those same levels of support, when they're at a disadvantage, is when you start to see that transfer shock in the GPA and in persistence rates. And so I think that just raising that awareness that, you know, our transfer students are doing just as well as all other students on campus when they get the support, starts to break down that myth that, as Veronica pointed out, has been rooted in pop culture and all sorts of forms of media. It might not have anything to do with their experiences with their own students. I'm not sure if you want to add on to that, Veronica.
No, I think I touched on this a little bit. I think it comes down to first recognizing that it's happening, that, you know, transfer students are being treated as, you know, others or secondhand citizens, and then training, right? Maybe doing some workshops with different faculty in different departments and colleges about, you know, how to build a more inclusive climate for transfer students. So yeah, I think it comes down to training and awareness.
Yeah, data don't lie. I mean, interpretations of data lie, but data doesn't, or data don't, I should say. So, you know, that's a great example, Jeff, of the infographic. The other thing is, you know, transfer is this sort of hidden identity. No one knows that you're a transfer unless you reveal it. So it's really interesting to me how faculty latch onto this idea, not knowing exactly who they might be thinking about within that myth, right? And, you know, you mentioned that, like, our perceptions of community colleges are rooted in pop culture and stuff. It's also rooted in elitism. And, you know, I think about my own experience, like being at a highly selective institution, like faculty latch onto that and they think about their own experience and what they're doing. So really, I love Veronica's idea of these trainings and these workshops to really like reflect and to dig into like what is perpetuating these perceptions that people on campus might have about students, really getting to the root of that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think with one or two more questions we're going to get to in the Q&A. We'll get to those answers there. Want to make sure we have time for our student presenters. But thank you both so much. This was a great conversation. So thankful that you both made the time to think about these questions and share your insights and your research. And again, we're just so grateful for your time.
Thank you for having us. I really enjoyed it. I love talking about transfer students.
Yes, any excuse to talk transfer.
Great. Let's see. Let's bring our slides back up. At this point, I'm going to invite Angeles from our office to come and lead us through our next section.
Hi, Jeff. Thank you so much, Veronica and Catherine, for that great presentation that really ties well with what our students here at UT Austin are going to talk about. I'm happy to present Christabella, Gabby, and Mandy, and I don't want to take more of their time, so I will start sharing their presentation for them to introduce themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Angeles. Welcome everyone. We're super excited to have you all here with us today. My name is Christabella Trimble-Keese, and I use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm actually a staff member working in the Transfer Your Experience program, and I've been doing that since fall of 2018. Today I'm presenting alongside two of our peer mentors, so I'll let them introduce themselves, starting with Gabby.
All right. Hi, I'm Gabby Garza. My pronouns are she, her. I am a government major, and my TRIG participation year was fall of 2019, and my TRIG mentor year was fall of 2020.
Hi, I'm Mandy Vachon. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a communication studies major, and I participated in a TRIG in fall of 2018, and I've been a TRIG mentor for about 4 semesters now.
Awesome. So now that y'all know, just a brief intro as to who we are, we'd like to give you some background into the Transfer Your Experience program and Transfer Your Interest groups. So the Transfer Your Experience, or TYE as we call it, started in the summer of 2015. And kind of like Jeff talked about earlier, it was really a student initiative. So student Senate representatives saw all the great support that was provided to students coming to UT directly from high school. And they saw a lot of that was academic support that transfer students couldn't access. So the Senate of College Councils focuses on students' academic life, and through a resolution that they put forward, our office was created. And so we do focus on academic success, but we know that social connections and finding one's place are super important to that transition and doing well. So our programs try to incorporate both of those aspects of student life. One of our biggest programs are Transfer Your Interest groups. These are learning communities of up to 24 students. These students are all transfer students in their first semester at UT. And they take 1 to 3 courses together during that first semester. So they might be in a really large course. Maybe it's 15 students in this group together in a class of 100, and they might be in another class of 30, but that same 15 is there. In addition to those content courses, they attend a weekly mentoring seminar. It's led by a peer mentor and a staff facilitator. Their peer mentor is an experienced transfer student who brings a lot of really great insight and advice from their own experience transferring to UT. And so this kind of just structure is really great for students getting connected. They see the familiar faces in these different sections of their classes. It has a great structure for setting up study groups because you have these courses in common. And so the peer mentor, through that mentoring seminar, they teach students about the different campus resources that are available, how to become an effective learner, and just try to provide opportunities for the students to bond. A mentor might take their students on a tour of the art museum on campus. They might bring a faculty member from one of their classes in to talk with them, or have something like the Sanger Learning Center teach about, present about finals tips or study strategies. Many students find that they do meet their future roommates and best friends through their TRIG. So before our mentors start working with students, they all take a training course. This is when we tell them about all the different campus resources that are available through UT. We give them some strategies for working with their students and having effective communication. And we also talk about learning mindsets, so specifically growth mindset and belonging mindset. Before we go any further, I want y'all to use, there's a little raise hand feature at the bottom. I want to see a show of hands. Who has heard of growth mindset? I'll give y'all 30 seconds to reply. Seeing the numbers go up. Okay, awesome. So it's looking like a good 50% of y'all have heard of growth mindset. I'm going to lower your hands. Now, what about belonging mindset? Who has heard of belonging mindset? Give y'all a few seconds to raise your hand if that applies to you. Okay, so a lot fewer. I'm seeing maybe 15, 20% of you all. Lower your hands. Cool. So we're going to talk a little bit on what is belonging mindset specifically. If you know stuff that we're not able to touch on in the presentation, feel free to put that in the chat and share it with everyone. We're happy to have a knowledge share here. But yeah, so we like to focus on belonging mindset with our students because it like relates in with sense of belonging. So in like getting the background for ourselves to teach our mentors about it, we were looking at the research and like who are the students that they work with for these learning mindsets. So I'm going to read out some of these quotes of how they describe the students that they work with. So they say, first, a stereotyped and socially marginalized group in academics, unsure of whether they will be fully included in positive social relationships. Another study, they may experience a chilly climate in which they feel unwelcome. This chilliness arises from explicit and implicit messages. And the third, they contend regularly with debilitating suspicions of intellectual inferiority. So I don't know when you hear these, if it sounds at all like it might be transfer students or relate to transfer students, but they're actually, none of these studies specifically study transfer. They work with students in K through 12, some of them in higher ed. They study specific populations of students, but none of them are actually transfer. But when we hear quotes from students like, you roll out the red carpet for freshmen, but ask us to enter through the back door, these do sound like some, in addition to the microaggressions and that we were talking about earlier, they do sound like these explicit and implicit messages that like students are receiving that can contribute to a chilly climate. So this is why we felt that belonging mindset would be a particularly good fit with working with transfer students. So yeah. So just to briefly define belonging mindset, it's when someone feels that they're valued and respected by their instructors and peers. They know that it's okay to question belonging and that it's okay to encounter challenges. So that might be kind of getting brushed off when they first reach out to a new peer, or maybe getting a really low exam score back that they didn't anticipate. That these challenges are okay. It's not reflective of whether they do or don't belong. It's just something that students encounter in their transitions, and it will get better over time. So in teaching our students about belonging mindset, specifically our mentors, we had them do some readings. We gave them a backgrounder on what does belonging mindset look like. You can go to the next slide, please. And all of our mentors in training, they wrote a reflection essay on their own transition, thinking about how their sense of belonging changed over time. We use belonging mindset as a guide for their decision-making, how they can maybe interpret what their students are experiencing or how they're viewing their own challenges. Do they have a belonging mindset, or maybe is that something that we can help them work on? And so through this and through the research, we've created an evidence-based exercise that our mentors do with all of our students during the TRIG seminar. And so you'll hear a little bit more about that later. We refer to it as the belonging mindset lesson. So hopefully this gives you like an introductory to like how we've used belonging mindset in the TRIG program, kind of how we set it up, that backgrounder. I'm going to turn it over to Gabby and Mandy now so that they can share their own experiences at UT, both as students and as peer mentors.
All right, thanks, Christabella. So it would be really nice if the sense of belonging came in a burnt orange drawstring bag at orientation, but that's not really the case. So for most transfer students, we really question our sense of belonging, and we often refer to this feeling as imposter syndrome. And in the most general sense, imposter syndrome is the experience of feeling like a fraud. Like at any given moment, somebody's going to just like, no, you don't belong. So what exactly does this look like for transfer students? So it can show up in like over preparation for assignments or tests. It could be a lack of acknowledgement for like achievements, even just getting into a new institution, or even minimizing these accomplishments to just getting lucky. Unfortunately, these feelings don't just go away on their own. They have the ability to manifest. So it might even look like missing out on an opportunity that you might have otherwise had taken. So how do students overcome this feeling? Unfortunately, there's no quick fix to solving this. As a transfer student myself, I really struggled with imposter syndrome. I transferred to UT as a journalism major with zero experience in interviewing skills or writing styles. And even in my own trig, I felt like I really stood out as somebody who didn't belong in that space. I was doing really well in all my classes, but I think I definitely put too much attention in academics and not so much in socializing with like campus or with my peers. I remember thinking if I just joined a certain org or started working with like a student publication that maybe I would find that sense of belonging that like everybody else seemed to have. But these just were not the answers for me. So some things that really helped me in these doubtful moments and some advice I like to give to new students is not to give up on the first sign of failure. For a lot of transfer students, this comes up when we figure out like our study habits from our previous institution don't always translate well to like a new setting. So not allowing a space for us to try something new without this judgment can really facilitate a space for imposter syndrome. I also think that addressing these feelings are very necessary. It's easy to let imposter syndrome take up space and time and energy that could be better spent doing something else. We should validate these feelings, but definitely not dwell on them. I think I really found my sense of belonging in the searching for it. I found that spending more time on campus and getting to know a city that like I wasn't familiar with was definitely helpful. Also talking to new people in my classes and speaking with advisors and TAs was really helpful, and especially reaching out to my mentor when I was having just problems adjusting, which kind of leads me to the last question. So how does a trig help students? Trigs are really useful in reminding us that we are not the only people that have ever felt this way. Having a mentor to reinforce my sense of belonging was a huge difference, especially like when you feel like you don't have someone to talk to. It was definitely the best resource that I could have asked for. And I know that other transfer students feel the same way. It's really important to not rush this process. I think if I had like one piece of advice to give to new students about this, is that like your sense of belonging is going to come eventually. Everyone's experience with it is a little bit different. So if I could ask everybody in the audience to use the raise hand function, if you've ever felt like you've been subject to imposter syndrome. All right, that's a lot of people. Cool. Not cool, but.
Yeah, I think probably everyone at some point has experienced feelings of imposter syndrome. Like Gabby, I definitely struggled with feelings of imposter syndrome. And I think that many transfer students can relate to those feelings. And then microaggressions can further reinforce the idea that you're this outsider. So I'm going to share some quotes from UT transfer students. And while I do that, if you want to use the raise hand feature to share if you've ever encountered a microaggression or anything else that contributed to a sense of imposter syndrome or made you feel excluded from the transfer institution in some way, you can go ahead and raise your hand while I read these. So one student said, I'm graduating in May of 2016 and always wish I had a Gone to Texas banner to hang on my wall instead of a written acceptance letter. Another student said, it's ridiculous when every single shirt says class of 20 something when that's not the year I'm graduating. And then finally, we touched on this earlier, a student said, and then when we talked to the department chair, they're like, well, it's not even close to our level, basically saying, yeah, you got an A, but it wasn't hard enough, so it shouldn't count here. And that was kind of frustrating because it was the hardest class I've ever taken. And for them to be like, you're not good, your version wasn't as good as ours because it was at a community college was pretty frustrating. So I noticed several of you like raised your hands. And I think that this just kind of further reinforces the idea that we're not alone. Like everybody kind of ends up going through similar experiences. Another contributing factor to my personal sense of imposter syndrome is the fact that I'm in my 30s and most of my classmates were in their late teens or early 20s. And I really wondered if I would be accepted by my student peers. I think all transfer students face different barriers, but as a non-traditional student, it feels like there's this extra challenge. Some of us are married, some of us are caring for children, a lot of us are working full-time and maybe going to school part-time, or we've had like a big gap between between high school and college. And so these realities kind of separate us from our cohorts who may be in a position to focus like all of their energy on academics. And then these concerns kind of transform into real differences made through comments made by other students or maybe our instructors. So here are a couple of quotes from other non-traditional students. Everybody in there is like 18 to 22, and the teacher's kind of like, when you go back home to mom and dad, you know, it's those kind of situations, they bring up all of these ways of trying to relate to the students, and it feels a little bit weird because it doesn't apply to me. Another student said, a student ignored me when handing out pamphlets to other students along West Mall. The student was shocked when I told her I was a student. These quotes really reflect some experiences that I've had. For example, there have been a number of times an instructor has said, like, ask your mom and dad about this event, XYZ event. But I vividly like remember some of those events. And sometimes I feel really self-conscious about sharing my experiences because I don't want other students to think like I can't relate to them, or maybe that I'm a know-it-all. Sometimes students like roll their eyes when I speak up about already knowing something the professor's talking about in those instances. And it's kind of a shame because if they gave me a chance, like my experiences might actually enrich the student learning outcomes. And so it can be just really like othering in those instances. But there are ways to foster a sense of belonging in spite of these microaggressions. And so just a few things that helped me feel like I belong. Joining a trig as a mentee, I just felt like I learned a lot more about the resources that UT had to offer, and it kind of helped me understand like UT culture all that much more. I probably without trig wouldn't have had the confidence to like seek out certain resources or even had like the awareness that they existed. And so my trig mentor really gave me a safe space and like a specific person that I could like reach out to for help, which made a big difference for me. Also, I joined a non-traditional student organization, and that was kind of a big breakthrough for me. At UT, where non-traditional students are definitely the exception. I think we make up like less than 4% of the population. So it's a really small group. So it's really easy to feel like you don't belong, especially because like in the microaggressions I mentioned, your identity isn't always acknowledged by other students or staff. And so finding other students that had navigated that experience was like really helpful for me. I also want to point out that the Transfer Year Experience Office was a really consistent source of support for me. Each semester, we kind of have to start over and meeting TAs and professors and like developing those relationships. So being able to go back to the TYE office and have familiar people to connect with like really helped with my anxiety. They were one of the only places like outside of my academic advisor where I didn't have to start over and reset. Also, I want to talk about how taking on leadership roles helped me foster my sense of belonging. For example, becoming an officer with the non-traditional student organization kind of cultivated this sense of responsibility that I needed to connect and understand my peers. We're all non-traditional, but that means a lot of different things for students. Like I mentioned earlier, some of us are parents, some of us are married, some of us are veterans. So I felt like I couldn't really represent this group in the best way if I only had a handful of conversations. I really needed to dig deeply and like listen to a lot of perspectives. And so through this role, I was able to connect with several people and learn about the unique challenges and concerns they had. I also want to touch on becoming a trig mentor. I really didn't think how much becoming a transfer mentor would influence my sense of belonging, especially in an environment as competitive as UT. A lot of times doing certain activities feels more about like building your resume rather than kind of like having a state of mind. And so finding other students and staff whose core values and beliefs incorporate a desire to help others really made me feel connected to them and made me feel more like I belong to the university. And so I want to take the time to invite you to share a moment maybe when you felt like you belonged at your institution, like when you kind of overcame that sense of imposter syndrome or like, hey, I'm I'm this outsider. And while you'll do that, I'm just going to tell y'all that my sense of belonging wasn't necessarily tied to a singular aha moment. It did take time and I had to try new things. But I felt like I belonged after spending time as an officer with the non-traditional org that I mentioned. And after like watching my new mentees kind of go through our seminars and like seeing them grow and gain their own sense of belonging, which made me feel more connected. And yeah, go ahead and share in the chat. I see someone said that becoming a peer mentor for transfer students really helped their sense of belonging. Another person said, I felt my sense of belonging more when I first went to office hours and started hanging out with my friends in the library. I've definitely heard students saying like just being on campus and like going to those study spaces where like other students are like really like, it's interesting how your sense of belonging can be tied to a physical space. Someone said when I joined, I became a mentee in my first year experience program. Absolutely, that definitely resonates.
Yeah, so there's definitely like a lot of things that can contribute to that sense of belonging. But you're kind of still like, okay, but what's that thing? Like, what's the thing that's going to change that for me? So it's not really just one thing that changes everything for you. There's a lot of different ways to encourage someone's sense of belonging. So for some people like Mandy and me, taking on that mentor role really reinforced that for us. We were able to give back to students who were going through a really stressful time that we were familiar with. And for some students, they feel it within the first couple months, but for others, it just takes more time. So how exactly do we build a sense of community in a trig? And I know I saw somebody in the chat earlier ask about, or in the Q&A ask about COVID and kind of, I guess, more of how we adapted that to a digital platform. So like I said, when we started that my mentor semester was last semester. So figuring out how to build a sense of community in a trig was really interesting. I knew that trigs like presented their own challenges in person. Like you have new students in a new environment and they're transfer students, so it's already pretty overwhelming. But finding a common interest between students can really be helpful in facilitating a space for students to connect further. So like Christabella mentioned earlier with trig students sharing classes together, most of my students were in very large classes where they weren't really interacting with anybody because the setting was just too big. So when we would meet in our weekly seminars, that was a space for them to like talk about assignments and lectures. And we even had like a very productive like conversation about some struggles they were having, and their advisor was sitting in, and she was able to actually take that to the department and help them get some change going for their classes. And I think Mandy has a really interesting common experience that she shared with her students.
Yeah, so last year when the pandemic hit, we went from in-person to online, and trying to figure out how to translate that was a little tricky. But there's actually kind of a cool story about the UT Tower. I pointed the wrong way. Our UT Tower, we have a peregrine falcon that is actually, fun fact, is the fastest animal on the planet. They can fly over 200 miles an hour when they're like hunting. And so we have our biodiversity team at UT actually has a live stream on her nest. And so we spent each class like pulling up the nest, talking about what we'd seen between each seminar and like seeing if her eggs were going to hatch. And it was like just kind of a cool way to like connect everybody. It was like this one kind of off thing, but it really was like a fun way to keep like people engaged.
Yeah, for sure. And then did you also make playlists for your students?
Yes, Spotify playlists where like everybody could contribute were like super fun. It was like really cool, like learning about everybody's taste in music. And then like when we had downtime or we were doing an activity where like there wasn't much talking going on, we would play it. And like we had like a lot of Backstreet Boys and like Whitney Houston dance parties. And it was pretty fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I love doing that. I also made a playlist for my trig too. And it's really nice because it seems like such a small thing, but it makes such a big difference to your students. And to the last point, feeling like someone can help. I think it's kind of ironic in the sense of like leadership, but it's kind of important to break that barrier between mentor and mentees. I always like to remind my students that like I was also a transfer student, or I'm still a transfer student, and I'm a undergraduate student, and I really understand like the feeling that comes with all that. It also allows students to feel more connected to their mentor. And at least in my experience, my students never had any hesitation with like reaching out with obstacles in an online setting or concerns about their classes or just needing some advice. And one pretty universal activity that we incorporate into our trig seminars are one-on-one meetings. It's a really great way to build connections with your students. So these are basically just informal meetings between mentors and mentees. For the mentor, it really helps you figure out like what you're doing right, what you can be doing more of to help them feel more comfortable on campus. And then for a mentee, like they really feel seen because it's a more intimate but like super informal way. It's like you're just having a conversation with a friend. And I always made it a point to remember like small details, whether it was the school they transferred from or their hometown or an organization that they had applied for. Following up with students is really important. It helps them feel more recognized. So those are just some like specific things we do to contribute throughout the semester. But Mandy is actually going to explain how we foster a sense of belonging with the belonging mindset lesson plan.
Yeah, so thank you, Gabby. Christabella kind of touched on this earlier, but the belonging mindset lesson plan is like, it offers an opportunity to mentors, for mentors to intervene to improve students' sense of belonging at UT Austin. This particular seminar shows students that all transfers experience challenges during their transition to campus, and demonstrates that it does get better over time through effort and resource utilization, and also provides a space for students to reflect on their own transitions, like currently and before. So this lesson plan is usually completed within the first 2 to 3 weeks of our trig seminar. And we're going to take a look at the video that we use to kick off the lesson plan.
You've done orientation before, you've done the first day of classes before, you've met professors, you've like met people, all of it you've done before, and it's hard to not just feel like more of the same or just going through the motions, but it just kind of takes time, and the little things start making you feel like this is my campus, I belong here. Like putting my UT email on my resume, that was just cool.
I've realized that, you know, if I am doubting my abilities, that means that I am where I'm supposed to be. I don't necessarily have to be like the best right now for what I'm, you know, getting into. That's something you learn.
So even though I was originally from here and I knew people here, I still really had to discover how I was going to tackle this university.
It was certainly an adjustment coming as an older student who lives off campus and is also married. Study sessions late at night at the PCL weren't always possible for me. Joining Students Over 25 just made me see that there are other people with unique stories who have faced various challenges that have brought us here, but it's not too late for us.
Taking some time and like realizing that it didn't matter how you got here, we're all here. And I think logically you understand that, but it just takes a while to catch up like emotionally and to like really just feel it.
I would advise students not to have so many expectations coming in, whether it's what GPA you're supposed to have, what your grades are supposed to be, how many friends you think you're supposed to have.
You know, everyone is just trying to figure it out. Like nobody really knows exactly what they're going to do. But it is important to have plans, to have options, but at the same time, it's an unfair burden to carry, thinking that you're the only person that doesn't have everything figured out.
My advice to transfer students and non-traditional students coming into UT is to not let your differences be a barrier to experiencing everything that the campus has to offer.
Okay, so after viewing this video, each mentor shares a personal story about a struggle that we faced when coming to UT. So I tend to view this video, each mentor shares a personal Sorry, I heard it was echoing back to me. After viewing the video, the mentor shares a personal story about a struggle we face when coming to UT. I tend to talk about fitting in socially, but some mentors might talk about or feel more comfortable talking about adjusting to the academic rigor at UT. Regardless, we try to pick one challenge and then discuss multiple approaches to overcoming that barrier. And then we'll facilitate a discussion where we ask students maybe what they notice about our stories and what they saw in the video. And then after we have that discussion, we'll ask the students to write a letter to a future Longhorn that offers advice to help ease their worries and about finding their place on campus. And I want to point out that we ask them to write a letter to someone else rather than to themselves, because if they're conscious of the fact that the exercise is explicitly for them, it might send a stigmatizing message that they're seen as in need of help. And so if you're sharing a message about something you learned with someone else, you're more likely to adopt this belief for yourself. And this comes from a growth and belonging mindset. This comes from both growth and belonging mindset interventions and the idea that saying is believing. And in my experience, those first day, I don't know what to say walls kind of come down quite a bit. My initial vulnerability shows that the trig is a safe space where they're welcome to be themselves and open up. And often students kind of will like eagerly share their concerns about acclimating to life on the 40 acres. And this discussion kind of helps foster the idea that they're not alone in their fears. Gabby, what are like some of your experiences with this?
Yeah, I think vulnerability definitely goes a long way with students. I think this lesson plan is a great first step in breaking that barrier that I kind of talked about. Yeah, I know it comes pretty early in the semester, but it is also kind of like a turning point. Yeah, you definitely can't have a trig without the lesson plan. Yeah.
For sure. And the thing is it can feel like a small thing in the moment. The lesson plan happens early in the semester and we don't necessarily directly circle back to it. But I found that like when doing the one-on-ones that Gabby talked about, my students will like intentionally or unintentionally circle back to this idea. And they'll talk about like, I really wasn't feeling like I was making friends, but I went to this event or I joined the student org and now I have like a ton of friends, or maybe I was struggling academically. So, I put it out there and I formed a study group and now like we're doing really well and we're going to meet up to like study for our midterm. And so it's kind of demonstrating the idea that I'm going to try new things to overcome these obstacles relating to their sense of belonging. And then I just want to say, if your college or university offers first year seminars, like we feel like this is a really good fit, and we encourage you to kind of create and implement a similar lesson plan to share early in the semester with students. However, if your institution doesn't offer first year seminars, you could still consider adapting a version of this to incorporate maybe into the like admissions process during new student orientation. Student organizations could take this and like use it to cultivate relationships with new members. Advisors could integrate these principles into meetings with students to kind of enrich student experiences and bridge the gap between like academic student life and that sense of belonging. But our main points that we want to share are like, be sure to normalize students' feelings if they're struggling with imposter syndrome and their sense of belonging. Encourage openness and vulnerability to strengthen those connections between students. Often this means like you start out by being vulnerable, and that's mentors, staff, anybody who works with students, like give them that safe space and let them know that like this is okay to feel this way. Lead by example. Also, we encourage you to formulate like tangible exercises, like the writing exercise we talked about. This reinforces those growth and belonging mindset interventions. And then finally, remind students that everyone struggles, but it does get better and they're not alone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mandy, Christabella, and Gabby for that great presentation. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties that we had after the video, but thank you all for your patience, and we can go into some Q&A questions and answers from anyone that has a question. I know we're over time, but we can at least have at least 2 minutes to get to the questions. One of the
Well,
questions is if,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, Jeff, you can go.
No, go ahead, Ellen. Yeah.
Is the Texas peer mentor role paid? Anyone would like to answer?
It is paid, but I would do it for free. I really like connecting with students. Like it just feels really good to give back. And I love meeting new people and hearing their backgrounds and their stories. But yeah, it is a paid position.
I do think it's important to have it as a paid position to recognize the work that goes into it. I will say for any students out there or any staff who are considering starting something and they don't know where to start without, you know, a substantial budget. I've had multiple students go through an entire semester of training and been like, oh wait, I get paid for this, even though it's been mentioned, you know, 3 or 4 times. So there's definitely students out there who would be willing, I'm sure, to help out and get a program started if you're trying to maybe pilot something with some student volunteers. And I think, you know, just for the time's sake, we're going to keep moving forward. If any other questions do come up in the chat, you know, feel free to answer them there to our panelists or to our presenters. I just want to thank you all for taking the time to prepare and share your program with us. So just kind of recap, you know, I think today we found that establishing a sense of belonging and creating a transfer receptive culture takes time and resources. That we can all be intentional in how we talk about transfers and how we can raise awareness with our peers and our colleagues, and that we each have the experience and ability to make change on our campuses. So we'll follow up again with some resources and emails. If you want to continue this conversation on social media, use hashtag Transfer Summit. And then we shared this in our email last time, we'll include it again, but we do have a document that really helps you plan out how to make a change on your campus. And so, as we say, plan the work and work the plan. Just a little preview for our next summit is coming up on April 19th. It's Transfers, Function, and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We're so thankful to have another round of excellent panelists and student presenters with Dr. Gloria Crisp, Dr. Dimple Jane, and then 2 groups from UCLA. Their Center on Community College Partnerships and their Transfer Student Center is going to be a really great session to close out our 21 Transfer Summit. I do want to make sure, you know, for the folks who were able to stick around a little bit longer, we do our AirPod drawing. Mandy, I think you have our wheel ready to go.
Yeah.
Let me see. Okay.
Okay, can everybody see the wheel? No?
I can see it.
You can, okay. Okay, cool. Thank you. All right. Emily, are you still here?
If you can use your raise hand function, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, I think she's gone. I'm gonna go to the next person. Laura, are you maybe still here? I don't see Laura. Okay, we're just gonna keep going until we have somebody who's here. Katie?
Yes, we have Katie.
Yay, all right, great. Well, Katie, I have your information. We will get in touch with you and get those mailed to you soon.
Thank you, Mandy, and congrats to Katie. And we really hope that this session was valuable to you, that you have a good idea of how to take some of these ideas and practice back to your campus. And very much looking forward to seeing you at the 3rd and final session of this webinar series. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you on the 19th.